On the freezing morning of February 2, 1808, long before the sun had risen over Madrid's narrow alleys, a silence heavier than snow lay across the city. People inside their shuttered homes could already sense that something was about to rupture. Rumors had spread for weeks. Napoleon's troops, thousands strong, were pushing deeper into Spain under the guise of Allied support. But by early 1808, everyone knew the truth. These were not guests. These were occupiers, and with their arrival an era of terror had begun, the kind that Spanish chroniclers would later describe as worse than death itself. The invasion of Spain did not begin with a battle, but with a deception. Napoleon convinced the Spanish monarchy that French troops simply needed passage to attack Portugal. King Charles Roman IV and his scheming favorite, Manuel Godoy, believed the lie. They opened the country's gates to the French army, assuming Napoleon would show gratitude. Instead, Napoleon saw weakness and seized it. Spain was divided, poorly governed, and exhausted by internal fights. By the time the royal court realized the danger, French regiments had already taken key fortresses, crossroads, and cities. It was a silent takeover, a masterclass in strategic occupation. Nowhere felt this more brutally than the towns and villages that fell under direct military control. French commanders established strict codes of behavior, but many soldiers ignored them. Armies that stay long in foreign lands always leave a stain, yet what happened in Spain became infamous across Europe. Women were often the first to suffer, not because they fought, but because occupying forces sought to break the will of the population through terror, humiliation, and violence. Contemporary Spanish diaries, such as those kept by clerics in Toledo and Granada, describe scenes too painful to forget. Women dragged from homes, families shattered, entire villages forced to watch degradation meant to crush resistance before it even formed. The most notorious episodes occurred during the winter and spring of 1808, when large groups of soldiers were quartered inside civilian homes. For Spanish women, this was the beginning of their nightmare. French troops demanded food, space, and obedience. Many soldiers viewed Spanish women not as civilians, but as spoils of war. The occupation blurred the lines between military discipline and unchecked brutality. In many villages, soldiers acted as though the law had evaporated. Women learned to hide at night, retreating to cellars or fleeing to the countryside when patrols passed too close. Those who remained often faced acts that chroniclers described metaphorically as the slow death of the spirit. There were heroic stories of resistance too, especially involving women. Spanish history remembers the figure of Agustina de Aragon who in June 1808 would fire a cannon to defend Zaragoza. But before that spark of rebellion came the months of deep darkness. Women bore the initial fury of the French occupation. The more the population resisted, the more violent the reprisals became. In early accounts recorded by Spanish parish priests, it is evident that the French strategy relied on fear. They wanted to force submission through psychological devastation. And for many families, especially mothers, sisters, and daughters, the worst horrors came not in battlefield clashes, but in their own kitchens and courtyards. The men of Spain were often powerless in these moments. Disarmed, watched, and threatened with execution, many husbands and fathers could do nothing but witness or flee. The French knew this. They understood human psychology well enough to realize that the destruction of women was a weapon. A broken family meant a broken community. A broken community meant a rebellious province crushed before it could rise. Madrid became the center of rising tension. The presence of General Murat's elite cavalry, the Mamelukes, added a new layer of fear. Their fierce reputation, combined with their armor and foreign appearance, terrified civilians. Women in Madrid wrote in their letters that they would pray not to hear boots in the street at night, for it often meant that another home was being invaded in the name of the emperor. But the Spanish people were not passive observers of their suffering. By April 1808, whispers of rebellion danced through taverns and marketplaces. Women encouraged their men to resist, even though they knew the consequences could be fatal. Mothers hid young boys so French officers would not seize them as volunteers. Every street, every doorway held tension like a drawn blade. The violence reached a breaking point on May 2, 1808 when Madrid finally erupted. The uprising did not begin with generals or nobility, but with ordinary civilians, many of them women. Stories spread quickly of French troops attempting to remove the last Spanish prince from the palace, and this was the spark that ignited the explosion. Women poured into the streets, shouting warnings, throwing tiles from rooftops, and even arming themselves with kitchen knives and stones. They fought not merely for nationalism, but for survival, dignity, and vengeance for the horrors they had endured. The French response was merciless. Murat's troops moved through the streets like a storm. The repression that followed was so brutal that Francisco Goya immortalized it in his painting series showing executions and massacres. Behind these bloody scenes was a deeper, quieter tragedy. Women, who had already suffered months of terror, now watched fathers, husbands, and sons executed in mass reprisals. By the end of May, the fear that once smothered Spain had transformed into fury. The occupation continued, but the people no longer bowed their heads. Women became messengers, spies, food smugglers, and resistance leaders. Their suffering had forged a rebellion that Napoleon himself would later call a cancer in his empire. By the summer of 1808, Spain had transformed from a subdued kingdom into a nation trembling between terror and revenge. The uprising of May 2 had exposed something Napoleon never anticipated, a people so enraged by humiliation and suffering that no force on earth could fully subdue them. And at the heart of this rage were the stories whispered from one town to another, tales of French soldiers inflicting cruelties upon Spanish women that wounded communities more deeply than gunfire or cannon blasts ever could. Even before the major battles of the Peninsular War erupted, the psychological war was already being waged. Spanish priests, village elders, and local chroniclers preserved devastating testimonies. In Castilla, Catalonia, and the Basque regions, entire families reported similar patterns. French patrols, often made up of junior officers far from home, moved through villages demanding compliance. When villagers refused or hesitated, women became the first targets, not always in the way later fiction imagined, but in ways that left permanent scars. The French used intimidation to silence dissent. They used humiliation to crush morale. They used threats against women as tools of control long before full-scale war engulfed the country. After May 1808, these acts intensified. When French commanders realized that Spanish civilians were rising everywhere, they sanctioned severe reprisals. In their official reports, Napoleon's marshals used phrases like pacification, disciplinary justice, and civil compliance. But Spanish diaries translated these terms differently. Pacification, to many families, meant soldiers storming homes at night. Disciplinary justice meant dragging fathers into streets while women begged helplessly. Civil compliance meant that every mother, sister, and daughter lived under the shadow of violence for months at a time. French soldiers, frustrated by ambushes from guerrilla fighters, often blamed local women for aiding the rebels. In truth, they were right. Many women secretly passed messages, hid weapons, and provided food to partisans in the mountains. But once suspicion formed, punishment came swiftly. In the region of Asturias, there are accounts of women being marched into public squares, surrounded by armed troops, and subjected to hours of threats and degrading treatment until entire villages were terrified into submission. It was not only physical harm that terrified communities, but the stripping away of dignity. In traditional Spanish society, a woman's honor was deeply tied to her family's pride. French exploitation of this cultural reality became a silent weapon of war. But out of the suffering emerged a new symbol of defiance, the guerrilla movement. These fighters, many of them young men who had witnessed French cruelty with their own eyes, took to the mountains to wage a war unlike any Napoleon had faced. And in nearly every guerrilla band there were women who became central figures. They gathered intelligence, spread false information to confuse French columns, and sabotaged supply lines. Their bravery was born from pain, and their determination came from knowing exactly what was at stake. The French response became more brutal with each passing month. General Dupont's actions in Andalusia were infamous. As rebels increased their attacks, French soldiers retaliated against civilian populations, particularly women, whom they accused of supporting the insurgents. Although official French documents tried to downplay these crimes, Spanish records kept by clergy and town councils preserved the raw truth. Stories circulated of soldiers forcing families to watch psychological torture used as punishment. The destruction of villages like Fuente Obgena and Écija became symbols of Napoleon's flawed belief that terror could break the soul of Spain. Throughout 1808 and 1809, it became clear that Spanish women were no longer passive victims. They had become engines of resistance. In Zaragoza, women fought in the bloody sieges that turned the city into an inferno. Agustina de Aragon, the woman who stepped over fallen soldiers to fire a cannon herself, became the face of female resistance. But thousands of unnamed women played roles just as heroic. They smuggled ammunition in sacks of grain. They carried messages through enemy lines disguised as peasant girls. They nursed wounded guerrillas and buried the dead under the cover of night. All of this intensified French hostility. Soldiers, frustrated by an enemy they could never fully capture, lashed out unpredictably. In the Basque region, entire households went underground during certain patrol hours, leaving homes empty and silent. Women learned to move like shadows, often traveling in groups, often hiding at the slightest noise. In Catalonia, families carved secret compartments in their homes, so daughters could disappear the moment foreign boots echoed in the streets. The emotional toll was immense. Letters written by Spanish women described nights without sleep, constant fear, and the psychological agony of expecting violence at any moment. Some wrote about losing their voices from screaming. Others described the humiliation of being treated as trophies by occupying troops. The French were fighting a war on the ground. Spanish women were fighting a war for survival. By late 1809, the war had reached its most chaotic stage. French forces were stretched thin across dozens of rebellious regions. Guerrilla attacks grew more sophisticated. British troops under Sir Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington, landed to support the Spanish resistance. This intensified French paranoia. Soldiers suspected every woman of spying. Punishments became harsher. French patrols searched houses at random, interrogated mothers in front of their children, and confiscated anything that could possibly aid guerrillas. Many women were dragged from their homes for questioning, and while not all suffered physical violence, nearly all endured psychological torment intended to break their spirit. French soldiers forced women to stand for hours in cold weather, threatened families, burned personal belongings, and destroyed religious icons, knowing how deeply Catholic devotion shaped Spanish identity. To many Spaniards, the violation of faith itself was a wound worse than death. Yet this cruelty backfired spectacularly. Every humiliation inflicted upon women became fuel for resistance. Guerrilla fighters would later say they fought not for the king, not for glory, and not for Britain, but for our mothers and our sisters. In some regions, entire guerrilla movements were formed after women publicly demanded revenge for the abuses they endured. One of the most haunting episodes occurred in Galicia, where a French column entered a rural village suspected of harboring insurgents. The troops searched every home, destroyed food supplies, and gathered the villagers in the central square. Women, were forced to watch as French soldiers interrogated their husbands and sons. Though not every act was recorded in official French logs, Spanish testimonies preserved the pain. It was not only the violence that people remembered, but the humiliation, the yelling, the dragging of families from their homes, the endless threats, and the cold silence afterward that devastated the heart of the community. As the war raged on, it became clear that the French occupation had created a unique kind of suffering. Women bore the heaviest psychological burden, living with continuous fear, loss, and grief. Many towns recorded a surge in widows, orphaned daughters, and women whose lives were permanently marked by the horrors of war. Their stories, though less documented than battlefield heroics, formed the emotional backbone of the Spanish resistance. By the end of 1809, the Peninsular War had consumed Spain in fire, blood, and anguish. Napoleon expected quick victory. Instead, he faced a population whose spirit grew stronger the more it was crushed. And at the center of that spirit were Spanish women, whose suffering had now turned into unbreakable resolve. By 1810, Spain had become a graveyard of cities, villages, and families shattered by war. The French occupation, once presented as a political maneuver, had transformed into one of the most brutal conflicts of the 19th century. And the weight of that brutality fell most heavily on Spanish women, who endured psychological torture, social humiliation, and constant fear that reshaped the country's identity forever. The French army was overstretched. Napoleon's marshals commanded tens of thousands of troops scattered across rugged landscapes, where every hill hid a guerrilla fighter and every farmhouse sheltered a potential enemy. The frustration of fighting a ghost, like resistance, was immense. Guerrillas never fought in the open. They vanished into forests, mountains, and village networks that no imperial army could fully penetrate. This left occupying French troops in a state of constant paranoia. They suspected everyone, especially women, who often carried messages for guerrilla bands, spread misinformation, or hid weapons beneath their skirts. In response, French soldiers adopted harsher tactics. They stormed homes more frequently, confiscated food, destroyed crops, and punished entire communities for guerrilla attacks they could not control. Spanish women lived through these endless raids, never knowing if a knock on the door meant a search, a beating, or worse. In many cases, the fear itself became the weapon. The French used intimidation deliberately, forcing women to stand in public squares while troops loomed over them, shouting questions, accusing them of espionage, and threatening their families. Some of the darkest testimonies came from rural areas where French units operated without close supervision from high command. Left to their own impulses, soldiers sometimes targeted women as a way to assert dominance. Though French officers recorded their conduct differently, Spanish priests and local scribes wrote in harsh detail about the psychological torment inflicted on mothers and daughters. Many were forced to watch their homes ransacked. Others were humiliated verbally, dragged outside, or threatened with violence unless they revealed the location of guerrilla fighters they often had never even met. The French military code strictly forbade abuse of civilians, but in the remote valleys and mountain villages of Asturias, Navarre, and Extremadura, discipline was uneven. Officers could not be everywhere at once. And in war, any vacuum of authority becomes an opening for cruelty. Yet it was the psychological scars that lasted longest. Spanish women described losing their ability to sleep, flinching at footsteps, and praying by the hour for safety. Some stopped speaking for months. Others aged visibly in a single season from the stress of constant fear. The French, meanwhile, blamed women for fueling the resistance. Marshal Soult, one of Napoleon's most capable commanders, wrote that Spanish women carry the fire of rebellion in their eyes. His complaint was not wrong. Women were the backbone of the insurgency. When their communities suffered humiliation, they demanded retribution. Their grief shaped the war more than any royal decree or foreign alliance. In the province of Aragon, women became central figures in a shadow network of resistance. They disguised weapons in baskets of vegetables, carried intelligence wrapped inside their clothing, and left coded signals on laundry lines to alert guerrillas of French patrols. Their involvement transformed the landscape of the war. Instead of a conflict fought only by men, Spain became a battlefield where even grandmothers and teenage girls played roles that terrified French commanders. For every act of resistance, French troops often retaliated tenfold, and again women bore the weight of that anger. One chilling example occurred in the small village of Temames. After a French column was ambushed by guerrilla fighters, the soldiers returned in fury, convinced that women had warned the rebels. The village chronicler described the aftermath: families forced from their homes, women interrogated under harsh threats, and a church desecrated as soldiers searched for hidden supplies. Although many accounts refrain from graphic detail, the emotional devastation was clear. Homes burned, livestock slaughtered, and personal belongings destroyed. Women stood watching helplessly as their lives were reduced to ashes. In cities, the situation was no better. In Barcelona, French troops patrolled with a severity that turned daily life into a theater of anxiety. Women were questioned at checkpoints, searched repeatedly, and treated with mistrust. French officers believed that nearly every uprising began with whispers exchanged by women in marketplaces and courtyards. To suppress this, they imposed curfews, confiscated anything that could carry a message, and punished entire neighborhoods when rebels struck nearby. Women could not visit relatives without being interrogated. They could not gather at fountains or churches without soldiers watching them. Their lives shrank into small, frightened routines. Yet despite their suffering, Spanish women fought back in extraordinary ways. Some used their social invisibility as an advantage. French soldiers often underestimated women as threats. This allowed many to slip past patrols unnoticed, carrying secrets that would later shape battles. Others became informants for British commanders working alongside Spanish forces. These women traveled in simple dresses, blending into crowds while carrying intelligence that allowed British and Spanish forces to strike precisely where the French were weakest. Many joined or assisted the juntas, the local governing councils formed after the Spanish monarchy collapsed. These juntas relied on women to mobilize villages, spread news, and maintain morale. Women held clandestine meetings in homes, passed coded letters, and distributed food to resistance fighters. Their collective effort turned Spain into an ungovernable land for French troops. The suffering inflicted by the French occupation was not only psychological or physical but cultural. Napoleon's soldiers targeted symbols of Spanish identity. They seized churches, looted monasteries, and mocked religious traditions cherished for centuries. To Spanish women, who were often the guardians of faith within families, this felt like a direct assault on their souls. Many described losing hope, feeling as though their country's spirit was being crushed alongside their dignity. But resilience grew through this pain. In many villages, women gathered in secret to pray, sing hymns, or share news of resistance victories. These gatherings kept communities from collapsing under terror. Elderly women in particular became beacons of courage, reminding families that Spain had survived past invaders and would survive Napoleon as well. Another layer of suffering came through displacement. As French troops advanced, thousands of women fled with their children into mountains or neighboring towns. They carried little more than clothing and bread, often walking for days through harsh weather to avoid patrols. Many died of hunger or illness along the way, but those who reached safety often continued supporting the rebellion from afar, sewing uniforms, cooking for soldiers, or teaching orphans to read so the next generation would not grow up in ignorance. Meanwhile, the French military grew increasingly incapable of controlling the population. Napoleon's marshals begged for reinforcements. Their men were exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. Many confessed privately that they could not defeat a nation whose women fought harder than its men. One French lieutenant wrote in a letter home, "Spain is not a place of war. It is a living hell created by its women. They whisper rebellion into the very air." His words captured the truth Napoleon refused to see. By **1008, 111 **, the war had reached a turning point. British forces secured victories alongside Spanish armies. French supply lines collapsed, their morale withered, and guerrilla attacks increased. Women who had endured unimaginable fear for 3 years now began to sense a shift. The occupiers were struggling, the empire was bleeding, hope, once faint, returned slowly, but the pain endured left a mark that no victory could erase. Entire communities had been psychologically shattered. Many women lived with trauma that Spanish writers later described as a wound passed from mother to daughter, a memory of fear that lingered in households long after the war ended. By 112, the Peninsular War had become the conflict Napoleon hated most. What he once believed would be a quick occupation had transformed into a national uprising forged by the suffering of families, the rage of men, and most of all, the unbreakable endurance of Spanish women. Their pain had reshaped the war, their resistance had sustained it, their stories, whispered across mountains, carried more force than gunpowder and steel, and as the French grip weakened, the memories of all they had endured became the fuel that drove Spain toward liberation. Across Spain, the French still held major cities, but the countryside belonged almost entirely to guerrillas. The empire's soldiers felt surrounded everywhere they marched. Roads were unsafe. Supply wagons vanished into ravines. Patrols returned half dead or did not return at all. And each time a French soldier disappeared, commanders accused local women of aiding the rebels. The cycle of suspicion, punishment, and humiliation worsened. Spanish women who remained under occupation lived in a strange twilight world. During the day, they performed household duties, visited markets, or tended to farms under the eyes of patrolling French soldiers. At night, many of these same women became messengers and informants. They memorized patrol routes, counted troop numbers, and carried secret notes sewn into the hems of their dresses. French officers rarely suspected old women or young girls, and that miscalculation became a weapon deadlier than muskets. The anger of occupying troops grew more unpredictable. By 1812, the French army was worn down by years of ambushes, poor supplies, harsh terrain, and a population that hated them with every breath. Their fury often fell on civilians, especially women. But now, instead of fear, women answered these pressures with a silent, coordinated defiance. When French troops raided homes in search of rebels, women hid their sons under floorboards. When soldiers demanded food, women served spoiled grain, saving good harvests for guerrillas. When officers threatened punishment, women stared back with cold hatred learned through years of suffering. One French sergeant wrote in his journal about a village where the women refused to speak a single word to his patrol. He described them as statues cut from grief and granite. This silent defiance terrified the French more than open rebellion. Open rebellion could be punished. Silent rebellion meant the entire country had turned against them. Meanwhile, the stories of cruelty inflicted by occupying soldiers did not disappear. They became a national memory binding Spain together. In Andalusia, women kept hidden diaries filled with testimonies of humiliation, forced searches, public intimidation, and the constant dread that came with every footstep outside their doors. In Aragon, widows gathered monthly to share news of battles and pray for sons lost in the mountains. In Galicia, young girls carried coded messages to resistance fighters disguised as harmless errands. These women preserved the emotional truth of the war, a truth that official documents could never capture. They recorded not only fear, but the moments of courage that kept families alive. Stories of women who hid wounded guerrillas in their barns for weeks. Women who misled French patrols by sending them down the wrong paths. Women who burned French supply crates in the night. Women who smuggled British weapons under baskets of vegetables. Even in cities like Madrid and Barcelona, where the French presence was strongest, women turned daily life into acts of resistance. They whispered news of approaching British troops. They sewed flags for future celebrations. They taught children songs about freedom, and in the darkest nights, they gathered in shuttered rooms to pray for the end of the occupation. As French power crumbled, the suffering inflicted on women became part of the justification for revenge. Guerrilla fighters, British soldiers, and reformed Spanish armies marched with renewed determination. Everywhere the French retreated, they found villages filled with women who had lost brothers, husbands, fathers, or sons. These women did not greet liberators with smiles. They carried a deeper, haunting sorrow that spoke of years of fear and degradation. The turning point came with the French defeat at the Battle of Salamanca in July 1812. When news of this victory spread, women celebrated quietly in their homes. They lit candles, they prayed, they hugged their children with trembling relief. And yet, the wounds left by years of occupation remained raw. French soldiers fleeing Salamanca left a trail of destruction behind them, lashing out at civilians, burning homes, and punishing anyone they believed had aided the British. In some towns, French commanders ordered entire neighborhoods emptied. Women and children walked for miles along roads filled with smoke and ash. Even in defeat, the occupation brought more suffering. But Spain was rising. British forces under Wellington pressed forward. Spanish armies reorganized. Guerrillas multiplied. Women's resistance intensified. They now openly defied French troops, refusing to bow, refusing to obey, refusing to acknowledge their authority. Some stood in doorways with arms folded. Others shouted insults as French columns retreated. A few spat in the direction of marching troops, an act of defiance that would have meant instant death only 2 years earlier. By early *** 1813 ***, the French were in full collapse. Napoleon could no longer spare soldiers for Spain. He needed them for his disastrous invasion of Russia. The empire was stretched too thin, and Spanish women, who had endured humiliation with remarkable endurance, now witnessed the crumbling of the force that had tormented them for so long. When the French finally retreated across the Pyrenees, women lined the roads, not with cheers, but with silent stares. Some held the hands of their children. Others carried nothing but memories. The departing soldiers avoided their eyes. They knew the stories. They knew the pain they had caused. And they knew that no victory could ever erase the suffering endured by these women. The end of the war did not erase what had happened. Spanish women carried trauma long after the soldiers were gone. Many lived with nightmares and anxiety. Some avoided speaking of the occupation altogether. Others wrote down their experiences so future generations would not forget. Their testimonies, preserved in local archives, convent chronicles, and family manuscripts, formed a collective memory that shaped Spain's national identity. In the decades that followed, poets, historians, and painters tried to capture their suffering and their courage. Francisco Goya's haunting prints, though focused on the broader horrors of war, symbolized the anguish families felt. His brutal realism mirrored the emotional wounds borne by women. Later scholars would argue that the Peninsular War was not only a military conflict, but also a war of survival fought inside homes, kitchens, courtyards, and hidden rooms. Women had not carried muskets or sabers in most battles, but they had carried the emotional weight of a nation. Their resistance proved that an empire can conquer territory, but cannot conquer a people whose mothers refused to surrender. In the end, what Napoleon's soldiers did across Spain was not just physical destruction. It was psychological devastation, humiliation, and fear that spread through families like smoke. For many women, the worst part was not a single act of violence, but the endless uncertainty, the constant dread, and the feeling of being powerless inside their own homes. That is why chroniclers later wrote that what they endured was worse than death. Their suffering reshaped Spain. Their endurance preserved it. Their courage helped defeat an empire.